Welcome back. I was reviewing this particular script last week and had to set it down twice. Not from emotion, but from the precision of its construction. The protagonist's move here is not rage, it is arithmetic. Watch carefully what happens when someone signs away an asset. Historical manhwa. The smell of old paperwork is specific. It is not the clean, almost clinical scent of a freshly printed document. It is something older. A combination of dust and slow humidity and ink that has already started to separate from the fiber of the page, returning to something formless. Liang Chao had always associated that smell with her father's study, with the stacks of folders he kept in mismatched manila envelopes, with the way he would spend Sunday afternoons cross-referencing lease renewals against property tax schedules, his reading glasses perpetually sliding to the end of his nose. He was meticulous about those folders. He was meticulous about almost everything. The notary office on Wenhua Road smelled exactly like that. Liang Chao sat in the hard plastic chair with her hands folded in her lap, watching the notary. A heavy-set man named Wei Dong, whose shirt was always slightly damp at the collar, regardless of season, fished through his own disorganized stack of documents. The overhead light buzzed with that particular frequency that sits just below the threshold of annoyance, present enough to register, but not quite enough to complain about. The window behind his desk had a crack in the lower right corner, sealed with transparent tape that had yellowed over time. Someone had placed a small potted succulent on the windowsill. It was dead. She had been in this office before, not in this life, but in the one before it. In that version of events, she had come here in tears. Not the visible, streaming kind, but the type that lives entirely behind the eyes, that makes everything slightly too bright and slightly too sharp. She had come here because Zhou Heng had given her an ultimatum. Sign over your half of the Linha building, or spend the next 3 years in litigation, while the tenants continue not paying and the municipal repair order turns the property into a legal liability that neither of them can escape. He had been patient about it. He had been almost gentle, which was the cruelest version of him. She had signed because she was exhausted, and because she believed him when he implied it was the only option. She had walked out of this office with nothing and thought she had done something dignified by choosing not to fight. She had been wrong about all of it. She knew that now with the particular clarity that comes not from wisdom or perspective, but from having lived through the consequence of that signature all the way to its end. The litigation she had tried to avoid had found her anyway, from a different direction. The exhaustion she had tried to conserve had been spent on something worse, and the gentle patience in Zhou Heng's voice had been the practiced calm of a man who already knew exactly how the mathematics were going to resolve, who was offering her a way to lose while making her feel as though she had chosen something. She was 31 years old again. It was a Thursday in late October, and the city outside smelled like rain that had not quite arrived yet. She was going to sign over her half of the Linhe building. She was going to do it today, in this exact office, with this same notary and his same damp collar and his dead succulent. She was going to do it for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with exhaustion or ultimatums or the quiet persistence of Zhou Heng's negotiating patience. She was going to do it because the building was already a corpse. Most people cannot see that from the outside. That was the architecture of the trap Zhou Heng had been constructing for almost 2 years. Assembling a property that looked, on paper and in photographs and in the way he talked about it over dinner, like a functioning asset. 6 stories of mixed commercial and residential space in the Haicheng district, 40 minutes from the city center, on a street that had been quietly rezoned for light commercial use 18 months ago. He had shown her the rezoning documents himself, presenting them like a gift, explaining that the foot traffic projections were promising and the tenant mix was strong. A canteen on the ground floor, a hair salon on the 2nd floor, a women's clothing boutique on the 3rd. She had believed it in her first life because she had not yet learned to read the seams of a fabrication. She had no legal background then, only her father's instincts and the rudimentary accounting knowledge she had accumulated across 3 years of junior-level work at a mid-size firm. She had looked at what Zhou Heng showed her and had not thought to ask about what he had not shown her. In the years after, in the litigation years, in the years when she began to understand exactly what had been done to her and by whom, she had accumulated something. Not wealth, not allies, but knowledge. She had spent the last 2 years of her first life becoming someone who could read the seams. And then a car on a wet road on a November evening had ensured that all of that accumulated knowledge had nowhere to go, except that it had come back with her. Ms. Liang? Wei Dong looked up from his stack with the slightly apologetic expression of a man who had mislaid something important. I have the transfer agreement here. I just need to confirm. You are transferring your 50% undivided interest in the property registered at Linhei Road, Block 7, Unit 3, Haicheng District. Correct. And you are transferring this interest to Mr. Zhou Heng, your current spouse, for consideration of 1 yuan as documented in the agreement. Correct. Wei Dong looked at her for a moment. It was not a suspicious look, more the look of a man who was trying to determine whether he needed to ask a follow-up question or whether this was simply one of those transactions that made administrative sense, even if it seemed financially peculiar. 1 yuan was legal consideration. It satisfied the technical requirement that a transfer not be a gift, which would carry different tax implications. It was a number that said, this transaction is real and documented, and neither party is pretending it is charity. You've had legal counsel review this document? I have. She had spent 4 hours the previous evening on a video consultation with a property attorney named He Sumin, who was young enough to still find the edges of certain estate law genuinely interesting, and who had confirmed everything Liang Chao already knew about the liability transfer clauses she had carefully requested be included in the agreement's language. He Sumin had flagged 2 sections as unusual, specifically the paragraph stipulating that the transferee assumed all existing and future obligations, encumbrances, and municipal orders associated with the property at the time of and subsequent to transfer. That's quite protective of the transferor, He Sumin had noted, with the mild curiosity of someone who was not yet jaded enough to stop asking questions. Yes, Liang Chao had said, it is. She had drafted those paragraphs herself. Zhou Heng's lawyer had reviewed the agreement last Tuesday. His name was Fan Bo, and he was competent in the way that lawyers who work predominantly for developers become competent. He knew the standard instruments well, and he knew when to push back on deviations from standard language. But Fan Bo had been given the agreement as a near final document, and he had been told by Zhou Heng, with the comfortable confidence of a man who is used to getting exactly what he wants, that the agreement was a formality, that Liang Chao was signing over willingly, that there was no adversarial dynamic here. Fan Bo had reviewed it in 90 minutes. He had missed the liability absorption clause. Or rather, he had seen it and had not understood it as a weapon because it did not look like one from Zhou Heng's perspective. From Zhou Heng's perspective, absorbing the full liability of a property you believed was an asset was not a concession. It was a routine acknowledgement. Fan Bo had initialed the document. All right. Wei Dong uncapped his pen and aligned the document in front of Liang Chao. If you'll sign here and initial each page. She signed her name in even, unhurried characters. Liang Chao, transferor. The pen moved across the signature lines with the same calm she had spent the past 7 months cultivating in this second life. The calm of someone who understands that visible emotion is a form of information, and that information is the one thing she could not afford to give freely. She initialed each page in the lower right corner. She set the pen down. She folded her hands again in her lap. Thank you, Wei Dong said, completing his own notarial stamps and signatures. I'll have the registered copy ready within 5 business days. Of course. She stood. She picked up her bag, a plain, dark canvas tote, not the leather attaché she would eventually afford, but appropriate for today, appropriate for the version of Liang Chao who was supposed to be simply letting go of something she could not manage. Thank you for your time. She walked out of the office. The air outside smelled like rain now. It had finally arrived while she was inside, a light, steady fall that darkened the pavement in irregular patches. She stood on the steps of the building and let it land on her face for a moment. Not for drama. She was not theatrical by temperament. She did it because cold water on your skin is a way of confirming that you are in fact inhabiting a body, that this life is real, that the things you have done in the past 20 minutes have material weight and material consequence. Then she took out her phone and called her accountant. His name was Deng Chao. And he was 44 years old, and he was the person who had taught her, in a different sequence of events, how to read the seams of a fabrication. She had met him in her first life during the litigation phase, when she had been desperate enough to hire anyone who might understand what had been done to her financially. He was not a warm person. He was a forensic accountant who had spent 2 decades examining the internal ledgers of companies and estates, and who had developed, as a result, the particular kind of economy with language that comes from spending most of your professional life looking at what numbers reveal when words are being used to conceal. In this life, she had gone to him 7 months ago, not because she was desperate, because she knew he was the right instrument for what she needed. She had walked into his office on a Tuesday morning in March, and she had set 3 documents on his desk: the original estate settlement from her father's death 3 years prior, the property acquisition agreement for the Linhay building, and a 2-page memo she had written herself in careful, precise language, describing the discrepancies she believed she would find if those documents were forensically examined. Deng Chao had read all 3 documents without speaking. Then he had looked at her over his reading glasses with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but the adjacent state, the look of someone recalibrating a prior assessment. "You want me to find the warehouse," he had said. She had been still for a moment. "What warehouse?" "If your father's estate was settled with a deliberate omission, the most likely vehicle for that omission would be a secondary asset registered under a holding entity. Based on the acquisition timeline in this document," he tapped the property agreement, "and the gap between the estate's declared value and what someone with your father's income and asset accumulation patterns over 30 years should have held, I would estimate there is at minimum 1 undisclosed commercial property. A warehouse, a storage facility, or a light industrial unit on the periphery of a commercial zone. These are the assets that get overlooked in estate documentation because they are not glamorous, and because they are often held through a layer of corporate structure that requires active investigation to trace." She had let him say it. Then she had said, "Yes, who concealed it?" "Zhou Rong, his sister, the one who had managed the estate administration on behalf of the family, who had done so with the kind of smooth, sympathetic competence that leaves no visible trace of what it has taken in the process." Deng Chao had made a note. "I'll need 6 weeks and access to the municipal business registration database." "You have it." It had taken him 4 weeks. The warehouse was in the Dongcheng Industrial Corridor, east of the city, on a street that the city's commercial development plan had quietly designated for mixed-use redevelopment in 18 months' time. It was 1,100 square meters of storage space, currently leased to a logistics company at a rate that was, on its own, unremarkable. But the land beneath it was the thing. It was held under a company called Qinghe Industrial Assets Limited, which had been registered in Liang Chao's father's name in 2009, and which Zhou Rong had, with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood how paperwork moves, restructured at the time of his death to transfer primary beneficial ownership to a family holding trust that Liang Chao had never been informed of. Zhou Rong had not forged documents. She was too careful for that. She had instead exploited a specific gap in the estate disclosure requirements, one that allowed assets held in corporate structures to be categorized as business interests rather than personal property, subject to a different disclosure timeline that, if allowed to lapse without challenge, effectively removed them from the estate without creating a visible record of removal. The window to challenge that categorization was 2 years from the date of final estate settlement. Liang Chao was currently 4 months from that deadline. Deng Chao had filed the challenge on her behalf in September through a civil petition mechanism that did not require a lawyer, did not require a court appearance, and did not, critically, require Zhou Heng or Zhou Rong to be notified until the administrative review was already in progress. The Linhay building had 3 tenants: the Meihua Canteen on the ground floor, which had been operating for 11 months, the Junji Hair Studio on the 2nd floor, which had been operating for 8 months, and the Ruchen Clothing Boutique on the 3rd floor, which had been operating for 6 months. All 3 tenants had signed 5-year lease agreements at attractive initial rates. All 3 tenants had also been presented with side agreements, addenda to the primary leases that established a commercial establishment period of 18 months during which no base rent would be owed, only a nominal management fee of 300 yuan per month. These addenda were not fraudulent in a strict legal sense. They were legitimate contract modifications, but they had been presented to and initialed by the tenants without any disclosure to Liang Chao as co-owner. She had discovered this in her first life after 2 years of wondering why the property's rental income never matched the figures she had been shown during the acquisition. She had discovered it when a tenant, the woman who ran the Ruochen boutique, a tired, practical woman named Chen Fang, who felt guilty about something she could not quite articulate, had left a copy of her full lease documentation on the counter when she stepped away to answer a phone call, and Liang Chao had glanced down and seen the addendum. In this life, she had obtained copies of those addenda through Deng Chao's connections with a municipal records service that filed lease documentation for commercial properties. She had obtained them in June. She had read them on a Wednesday evening at her kitchen table with cheap supermarket tea cooling in a cup beside her. She had felt nothing in particular upon reading them, which was not numbness. She knew the difference now, but the specific sensation of a piece of information settling exactly into the space that had been prepared for it. The addenda were not her problem, that was the point. As of today, they were Zhou Heng's problem entirely. She walked to the bus stop on the corner of Wenhua Road because she did not yet own a car in this life, and because the bus was adequate, and because she did not need to perform wealth, she had not yet assembled. She sat in the second-to-last row, which was largely empty at this hour, and she took out a small notebook and opened it to the page she had been maintaining for the past 3 months. The notebook was unremarkable. Blue cover, college-ruled pages, the kind sold in blocks of 5 at the stationery shop near her apartment. Inside it was a record that would have looked, to anyone else, like a financial planning document with unusual specificity. There were dates and property register numbers and figures accompanied by small annotations. There were names cross-referenced with registration data. There were 2 columns on the last page that she had been updating as each element resolved. The left column was labeled Exposure. The right column was labeled Clean. Under Exposure were the following items, each now checked off. The Linhei Building. 50% ownership in a property carrying a municipal structural remediation order, issued in August of this year by the Haicheng District Infrastructure Bureau, requiring comprehensive foundation and facade work estimated at 2.3 million yuan, to be borne by registered property owners in proportion to their holdings. Accumulated arrears and property management fees dating back 14 months. A bank lien registered against the full property value by Dongcheng Commercial Bank under a business credit facility that Zhou Heng had secured using the property as collateral. Facility Liang Cao's name appeared on as co-obligor because she had signed what had been described to her as routine property management documentation 18 months ago, and which had, in the fine print of page 7, constituted a guarantee of the borrower's obligations. She had signed it without reading page 7 in her first life. She had read page 7 before signing it in this life. She had read page 7, and she had said nothing, and she had signed it anyway, and she had immediately retained Hisumin to document the signing under conditions of material misrepresentation, establishing an evidentiary record that the guarantee had been obtained without adequate disclosure of its nature. That record was sitting in Hisumin's files. It would remain there until it was needed. Under Clean were the following items. The Dongcheng Warehouse. Status, under administrative review. Expected resolution, 6 to 8 weeks. Projected clear market value at current industrial land. Prices, 4.1 million yuan. Projected value at post-redevelopment land classification, 18 months out, 7 to 9 million yuan. A secondary investment account she had opened at a bank in which neither Zhou Heng nor any member of his family held any account. Balance, 218,000 yuan, accumulated over 7 months through a combination of her salary, the dissolution of a small joint savings account she had carefully moved before Zhou Heng's attention was directed elsewhere, and the sale of several pieces of jewelry her father had given her, which she had sold not out of desperation, but out of the practical recognition that jewelry is a sentimental asset with low liquidity and she needed liquidity. A lease agreement she had signed, under her name only, for a 1-bedroom unit in a district across the city. She had not moved there yet. She would. She closed the notebook. The bus moved through the late afternoon rain, its windows developing. That soft blur that wet weather creates, the kind that makes the city look slightly fictional from inside. The woman in front of her was watching a video on her phone with the sound low, a cooking show of some kind, the small sounds of a kitchen carrying back through the seat. Somewhere toward the front, a child was asking questions in the patient, relentless way of small children, and a man's voice was answering with the slightly threadbare patience of someone who had answered the same question more than once today. Liang Chao looked at the city through the blurred window. She was thinking about the morning, 6 years ago in her first life, when she had met Zhou Heng at a mutual friend's dinner and had thought, with the particular clarity that the wrong kind of certainty creates, that she understood what she was looking at. He had been composed. He had been thoughtful in the way that some people perform thoughtfulness so well that it becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. He had asked her about her father's property work with genuine seeming interest, and she had answered with genuine interest because she had loved her father's careful, methodical approach to assets, and she had believed then that shared interest in a subject was a kind of window into a person. She did not hate him for what he had done. She had worked through that in the litigation years. Hate required a sustained emotional investment that operated at the expense of other capacities, and she had been too poor in those years, in resources, in time, in the particular energy that functional dignity requires, to spend it on hate. What she had arrived at was something more structural. The understanding that Zhou Heng was a person who treated other people as components in a system, who was not malicious in the way that cruelty requires intention, but who was the specific type of dangerous that comes from having never developed the capacity to register another person's loss as a real event. He was going to experience a real event now. She would not be present for it. She had no interest in presence. The satisfaction she had assembled over these 7 months was not the hot, volatile kind that requires an audience. It was the cold, settled kind that lives in paperwork. The call with Deng Chao lasted 11 minutes. He confirmed that the administrative challenge on the Dongcheng warehouse was now at a stage where a preliminary finding from the Estate Review Office was expected within 3 weeks. He confirmed that the documentation they had submitted was strong. He said in the dry, accounting-specific way he communicated positive assessments that the categorization error was substantial and the remediation pathway was clear. He had used the word unambiguous twice, which from Deng Chao was the financial equivalent of enthusiasm. She thanked him, hung up, and got off the bus 2 stops early to walk the remainder in the rain. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had been built in the early 90s and had not been significantly renovated since. The elevator worked roughly 70% of the time. The hallway on her floor smelled of cooking oil and the particular staleness of shared wall insulation. The door to Unit 4B stuck slightly at the top left corner and required a brief upward lift of the handle before it would open smoothly. She had been planning, in her first life, to move to the apartment Zhou Heng had acquired in the newer development on the west side of the city, which had been part of the future he had sketched for her in the early years of their marriage, the one with the natural light and the clean lines and the building management that answered maintenance requests within 48 hours. She had moved there eventually. She had not liked it. Here, she set her bag on the table and put water on for tea and sat down in the single chair she used for actual thinking rather than the couch, which was better for television and worse for clarity. She had learned this about herself in the years of litigation. That environment shaped cognition in ways that were small and consistent, and that small and consistent differences compounded. The chair was positioned facing the window, which faced a secondary street, which at this hour was carrying the particular low traffic of people returning home and delivery vehicles completing their last circuits of the day. She took out a second notebook. This one had a different function. The first was a record of what had been done. This one was a record of what remained. She turned to the current page. Zhou Heng. This was the more complex element. Zhou Heng would absorb the Linhe building and its liabilities and would discover, in stages, what he had absorbed. The municipal remediation order would become public record in approximately 6 weeks. She knew the timeline because she had, in this life, attended a public forum on the Haicheng District Infrastructure Review that had covered the order timeline in the kind of vague but traceable bureaucratic language that told you exactly what you needed to know if you already understood what you were listening for. The bank lien would surface during the first audit cycle after the property transfer registered. The tenant addenda would become relevant when Johang, having absorbed full ownership, attempted to enforce the lease terms and discovered that he had 3 tenants paying 300 yuan per month for another 7 months, and then base rent for the remainder of a 5-year term that would, in light of the structural remediation work, be essentially unenforceable without extensive legal intervention. All of that was Johang's system returning its costs to him. Zhou Rong was different. Zhou Rong had not constructed the Lenne trap. That had been Johang's architecture. What Zhou Rong had done was quieter and more personal, and had been done with the specific, particular coldness of someone who understood that Liang Chao's father had loved her and had spent 30 years accumulating something for her, and who had looked at that and made a calculation. She had made the calculation because she could, because the estate administration had been given to her by Johang, by the family, by the mild and overwhelming force of assumption that family handles family matters. And because Liang Chao, at 29, newly married, in the fresh grief of her father's death, had trusted the process the way people trust processes when they are too exhausted and too shattered, not the forbidden word, she reminded herself. The substitute was fractured, and that wasn't better, and so too undone, to interrogate every document set in front of them. The warehouse. Zhou Rong had known about the warehouse. Of course she had. She had administered the estate, she had processed the asset documentation, she had been the one to certify the inventory. She had known about Qinghe Industrial Assets Limited, and she had restructured the beneficial ownership over 3 corporate actions in the 14 months following Liang Chao's father's death, each action individually small enough to be characterized as routine administrative maintenance, collectively constituting a transfer of beneficial interest that Liang Chao had never consented to and had never been informed of. The administrative challenge Deng Chao had filed was going to surface this. What it would surface, specifically, was a paper trail of those 3 corporate actions, each of which had required Zhou Rong's signature as a state administrator, each of which had generated a filing with the Business Registration Bureau, each of which was now going to be examined by an administrative reviewer, whose mandate was to determine whether the estate's asset disclosure had been complete and accurate. Zhou Rong was going to receive, in approximately 4 weeks, a formal notification that she was the subject of an administrative inquiry into estate administration conduct. This notification would go to her registered address. It would be formatted in the specific, gray-toned language of municipal bureaucracy that manages to be more threatening than any direct accusation, because it says nothing that can be denied and implies everything. Liang Chao turned the page. On the next page, in her careful, small handwriting, was a list of dates. She had been maintaining this list since the beginning. Not a to-do list. The to-do list was in her head, organized not by date but by dependency, each action contingent on the completion of the prior one. This list was different. It was a record of what had already happened. Not to her, or not only to her, but in the first life, and now in this one. The date of her father's death, the date of the estate settlement, the date she had first seen the Lin building and believed it was an opportunity, the date of the guarantee she had signed without reading page 7, the date in her first life when she had found the addendum in the Rushen boutique, the date she had walked into the litigation attorney's office and understood that she was going to lose, the date the car had come, and then the dates of this life. The date she had woken up in her old apartment, 31 years old, with everything she had learned deposited in her like sediment. The date she had first called Deng Chao. The date the warehouse file had been opened. The date the liability transfer clauses had been drafted. The date of today. She closed the notebook. She thought about Chen Feng, who ran the Ruchen boutique. Chen Feng was not complicit in what had been done. She was a tenant who had been offered a favorable addendum to a lease and had accepted it, as any reasonable person in her position would. She had signed something that had been presented as standard. She had been used as a component of a trap that she could not have known was a trap. This was the category of person that Liang Chao had spent a considerable amount of internal time considering over the past months. The people who were not doing harm, but were positioned inside structures of harm in ways that made them, from the outside, look like participants. In her first life, she had been angry at them too, at the tenants who had kept their favorable terms while she was losing the building, at the people who had attended the family dinners, and treated Zhou Rong with the warmth of normal social affection while the estate documentation was being quietly restructured. She had been angry at all of them, and the anger had been undiscriminating and it had been expensive. Now she understood the taxonomy better. The people who had made decisions, the people who were positioned inside decisions that others had made. You did not apply the same response to both categories. Chenfang would still have the boutique. That was her business, her livelihood, her years of work. She had signed a contract that would remain valid regardless of who owned the building. Property transfers did not terminate existing tenancies. She would simply, at the end of her establishment period, owe rent to a different owner. An owner who would discover the addendum and be furious about it, and have no one to direct that fury toward except the person who had constructed the lease terms. Zhou Heng, the water had boiled. She made tea. She stood at the window with the cup and watched the secondary street below in the rain. A delivery driver had stopped his vehicle at the corner and was eating from a takeout container balanced on his handlebars, the economy of someone who had learned to extract meals from the margins of transit time. A couple under a single umbrella were having an argument in the particular low-voiced, contained way of people who have been arguing all afternoon and have run out of volume. She drank her tea. The next 3 weeks moved in the measured, accumulating way that she had taught herself to inhabit. Not with patience exactly, because patience implies waiting for something, and she was not waiting. She was working. She was filing and documenting and monitoring the progression of bureaucratic timelines that she understood now with a specificity she had paid for in the worst currency. She went to work each morning at the accounting firm where she had been employed for the past 8 months, a mid-size firm called Hung Yuan, which dealt primarily in small to medium business audits, the kind of work that was not glamorous but was precise and kept her in contact with the exact type of financial documentation she needed to be fluent in. She was not the most impressive person in the office. She was not trying to be. She was trying to be invisible in the way that competent people can be invisible when they choose, building a reputation for quiet reliability that was not interesting enough to attract the wrong kind of attention. She worked. She ate lunch at her desk more often than not, instant noodles or convenience store rice boxes that were cheap and adequate. She answered questions from junior staff with the even patience of someone who had no investment in being perceived as brilliant, but was genuinely interested in making sure the thing was done correctly. She left at a consistent time. She did not discuss her personal life at the office. On the 11th day after she signed the notarized transfer, she received a message from Zhou Heng. She had been expecting contact. Not necessarily this specific message on this specific day, but contact was inevitable. The transfer would have registered with the Property Bureau by now, and the formal processing of the document would have generated a notification, and Zhou Heng would have received his copy of the registered transfer and read it and realized something. The message read, "The transfer documentation includes language about liability absorption. I need you to clarify what that means." She read it twice. Then she set her phone face down on the desk and finished the column of figures she was working through. She responded that evening from her apartment in carefully neutral language. The language is standard for transfer agreements of this type. It simply confirms that the receiving party assumes full responsibility for the property going forward. I'd recommend you discuss any questions with your attorney. There was a pause of 47 minutes. Then, Fanbo says the language is broader than standard, specifically the sections on future municipal obligations. She replied, "I'm sure he can explain the implications. I transferred the property in good faith. There's nothing unusual about protecting a transferor from claims after the date of transfer." The conversation ended there. She noted the date and time of both messages in the first notebook. On the 14th day, Deng Chao called her to report that the administrative review of the estate had completed its preliminary examination and had formally requested a response from Zhou Rong regarding the 3 corporate restructuring actions. Zhou Rong had been served with the notice at her registered address. She had 7 working days to provide written documentation of the basis for those actions. "How strong is her position?" Liang Chao asked. "She doesn't have one," Deng Chao said. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without the upward inflection that would make it sound like an opinion. He said it as though it were a factual property of the situation, the way a bridge engineer might say a specific structure cannot bear a specific load. The restructuring actions were not accompanied by the disclosure documentation that estate administration law requires when beneficial ownership is affected. There is no record of a beneficiary notification. There is no record of consent. The only way to defend the actions is to argue that the company was not an estate asset, which requires demonstrating that the beneficial ownership had been transferred prior to the estate opening. She cannot demonstrate that because the dates of the corporate actions post-date the estate opening by 11, 22, and 31 days respectively. Liang Qiao was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does resolution look like?" Assuming the administrative review reaches its natural conclusion without challenge, and based on the documentation you've provided, the challenge window has already passed for the primary estate settlement. The likely outcome is a finding of improper exclusion, a remediation order requiring the beneficial ownership to revert to the estate, and a fresh estate distribution calculation. Since there's only one surviving direct beneficiary, me. The warehouse and its associated land interest would be assessed for distribution to you, net of any administrative fees. You would then have the option to negotiate a private settlement or proceed through the formal distribution mechanism. Timeline? Best case, 8 weeks from the preliminary notice, more likely 12. The review office has a backlog. She thanked him and ended the call. 12 weeks. She had accounted for that. The lease on the apartment across the city was for 12 months, giving her adequate time to complete the warehouse resolution before she needed to make any decisions about where she would eventually live. The investment account had enough liquidity to cover her expenses for 18 months without touching the warehouse assets once they were available. She was not in a position of pressure. She had been in a position of pressure before, and she recognized it now by its absence. The absence of the specific tightness across the shoulders that comes from knowing that any delay in any element of your plan means a month of survival or 2 months of survival instead of the trajectory you had been working toward. She did not have that tightness. She had something different, something she had not been able to name for the first several months of this life, but which had become clearer as the elements accumulated. It was the sensation of a person who has been walking for a long time in wet clothing and has finally stepped into a dry room. Not warmth yet, not comfort, just the absence of the wet, the specific relief of being dry. On the 19th day, Zhou Heng called. She had not spoken to him by phone since the separation proceedings had begun in September. She had not initiated them. He had. That was another thing she had understood from the first life. The person who initiates separation proceedings carries an implication of grievance, of being the party with something to protest. She had let him initiate because she had no grievance she needed documented. Her grievances were not going to be resolved in a family court. She answered on the 3rd ring. "I need to discuss the property transfer," he said. His voice had the particular register of a man who has concluded that the polite approach has not yielded the result he wanted and is now considering a different approach. She had heard this register before. In the first life, it had preceded either a concession or an escalation, and she had spent many years not being able to predict which until she understood the tell. He paused slightly longer than normal before his sentences when he was preparing an escalation. He paused before his first sentence. "There's nothing to discuss," she said. "The transfer is notarized and registered. The liability language is not standard. It's legitimate. You had an attorney review it. Fanbo didn't fully analyze. That's between you and Fanbo." She kept her voice level, the way she kept the sound of typing level when she was transcribing information that she found disturbing. Mechanical, steady, the fingers doing one thing while the mind did another. "I transferred my interest in good faith. I wasn't required to explain the implications of standard transfer language to your legal counsel." A pause, longer than the previous one. "There's a municipal order on the property." "There may be. You'll want to check with the Haiqing District Infrastructure Bureau for details." "Liang Qiao?" His voice shifted. Not angry. He was too controlled for visible anger on the phone, but the politeness had receded far enough that the structure underneath it was audible. "If you had information about an encumbrance on that property that you didn't disclose before the transfer, that constitutes fraud." She let the words sit for a moment, not because she was rattled by it, because she wanted him to hear the moment after he had said it, when neither of them was speaking, when the word was just existing in the air of the call, which was also the moment when he would feel the slight contraction of having used a threat and having it not land. "I had the same access to information about that property that you did," she said. "I was a co-owner. You manage the property. If there's an encumbrance, you'd know more about its origin than I would." She paused. Not a strategic pause, just the natural pause of someone completing a thought. "I'd suggest you speak with the Infrastructure Bureau and with your bank about the Dongchang facility." Silence. "Why the bank?" "Property transfers trigger a review cycle on secured credit facilities. It's routine. Your loan officer can walk you through it." She said it the way she said most things in this life, as though the information were simply available, as though she were describing the weather. "I have to go. I have work in the morning." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the chair facing the window. The street below was quiet at this hour, past 10, the secondary street emptying toward its nighttime version of itself. A cat was sitting on the hood of a parked car with the contemplative self-possession of an animal. That does not acknowledge the concept of trespassing. She thought about the bank call. When Zhou Heng called Dongchang Commercial Bank tomorrow morning, he would be connected to a loan officer who would explain, with the particular measured regret of banking professionals delivering unwelcome information, that the credit facility secured against the Linhei building had triggered an automatic covenant review following the property transfer. The covenants of the loan required that the borrower maintain ownership of the secured asset. A transfer of ownership, even if the borrower retained a 50% interest after receiving the transfer, constituted a change in the security arrangement requiring review. This was real. It was in the loan agreement. She had read the loan agreement, which was one of the documents she had obtained during the months of assembling the case for where she stood. The review would likely result in a demand for either the reinstatement of the full original ownership structure, impossible now that her half had been registered under his name, or the accelerated repayment of a portion of the outstanding balance to restore the loan-to-value ratio. The outstanding balance on the credit facility was 1.4 million yuan. The Linhei building, assessed against its current actual income, 3 tenants paying a combined 900 yuan per month, and its current municipal obligations, 2.3 million yuan in remediation costs, and its current market value adjusted for those obligations, was worth less than nothing. It was a negative asset dressed in a building's physical form. Zhou Heng had been planning to sell it. She knew this because in her first life she had been shown the prospective buyer documentation. A development company called Xincheng Holdings that had been looking to acquire mixed-use properties in the Haicheng district for a commercial redevelopment project. The sale price had been discussed in the early stages at 2 million yuan, which, split 50-50, would have given each of them 4.1 million. It had been a clean figure. It had been, she understood now, the number Zhou Heng had planned to show her when he needed to demonstrate that the Linhei building was valuable and her signing over her half was a sacrifice. Except that Xincheng Holdings had suspended its Haicheng acquisition program 7 weeks ago, citing revised commercial density projections in the district's updated zoning plan. She knew this because she had attended, again as a member of the public at a district planning forum, the session where the revised zoning plan had been presented. And she had noted the implications for the Haicheng commercial development corridor, and she had understood that the buyer Zhou Heng was counting on was no longer buying. He did not know this yet. He would know it when he called Xincheng Holdings. There was no satisfaction in imagining the call. There was only the mechanical completion of a sequence, the way a series of load-bearing calculations resolves when the final figure is entered, when the structure either holds or it doesn't. It did not hold. She went to bed. The administrative review concluded in 9 weeks, not 12. Deng Chao called her on a Monday morning, his voice carrying that same flat affect, saying, "The finding has been issued." She received the official documentation that afternoon, 14 pages of administrative review conclusions in the gray, precise language of bureaucratic determination, each section numbered, each finding referenced against the specific regulatory provisions it engaged. She read it at her kitchen table with the same cheap tea and the same even attention she had given every other document in this process. The finding was unambiguous. The word appeared in paragraph 4.3. Deng Chao had predicted it. The 3 corporate restructuring actions were found to constitute improper estate asset exclusion. The beneficial ownership of Qinghe Industrial Assets Limited was ordered to revert to the estate of Liang Jinrong. Her father's name, seeing it on a legal document, always did something to her that she could not fully control. A slight constriction in the chest that was not grief exactly, but its residue. The remaining physical fact of having loved a person who was gone. The remediation pathway was the formal estate distribution mechanism, given the absence of an alternative beneficiary claim. There was, attached as a supplement, a separate finding regarding Zhou Rong's conduct as a state administrator. The findings in this supplement were more carefully worded than the primary determination, with the administrative hedging that characterized findings that were going toward a conduct referral rather than simply an administrative correction. Words like systematic and documented pattern and failure to discharge fiduciary obligations appeared in the supplement's 3 pages. The supplement would be forwarded, per its own language, to the relevant professional licensing body for estate administrators for assessment of whether a conduct review was warranted. Zhou Rong held a professional certification. She had built her professional identity around it. She had used it to be placed in charge of administering Liang Chao's father's estate. The certification was issued by a licensing body that took conduct findings seriously in a way that administrative determinations sometimes did not, because the professional stakes were real. Not financial liability, not criminal exposure, but the specific, irreversible consequence of losing the credential that defined what you were. Liang Chao set the document down. She picked up her phone and called He Sumin. "The finding came through," she said. "I saw it." He Sumin had access to the administrative review portal. "Your timeline was accurate. I'd like to begin the formal estate distribution application today if possible. I can file the application today. It's straightforward given the finding. There's no competing claim, the asset is clearly identified, the beneficial ownership chain is documented. I'd estimate 6 to 8 weeks for the distribution order. And during that period, the asset is frozen. From disposition, yes. Zhou Rong cannot move, sell, encumber, or restructure the holding company in any way from the moment the finding was issued. That happened this morning." Liang Chao was quiet for a moment. "Good. There is one additional thing," He Sumian said. She heard in his voice the particular quality of someone who had prepared for a reaction and was curious what shape it would take. "The finding has to be served on all relevant parties, including Zhou Rong." "I know. She'll receive it today." "I know. Is there anything you want me to communicate to her counsel if they make contact?" "Nothing." She considered. "If they make contact, you can let them know that I'm not interested in a private settlement. The distribution mechanism will run its course." A brief pause. "All right. Thank you, He Sumin." She meant it, not in a warm, expressed way. She was not trying to cultivate warmth in professional relationships, only competence and reliability, but in the simple, functional sense of acknowledging that he had done his work well and that mattered. She ended the call and sat for a moment. Then she did something she had not done in a long time. She opened the drawer of the kitchen table where she kept the things that had no practical home elsewhere: a small flashlight, a spare set of keys, a receipt she had been meaning to file, and in the back of the drawer, a photograph. Her father in the study with the mismatched manila envelopes, not posed, just present, caught mid-reach for something on the shelf behind his desk, his reading glasses on the end of his nose. Someone had taken it with a phone camera years ago and printed it small, and it had been in the back of this drawer since she had moved into this apartment, placed there not because she had forgotten it, but because she had not yet been in a position to look at it without the looking costing something. She looked at it now. He had been meticulous about those folders. He had spent 30 years building something. He had not built it with strategy. He had built it with the slow, patient accumulation of a person who believed in the compound value of care. He had believed that if you paid attention to the details of a thing for long enough, the thing would be worth what the attention deserved. He had been right. She put the photograph on the table, face up, not to sentimentalize the moment, just to have him in the room while she finished this. There were 3 more weeks before the distribution order would come. During those weeks, several things happened that she had not planned, but that were not surprising. Zhou Heng's attorney filed a challenge to the liability transfer clauses in the Linhe transfer agreement. The challenge was submitted to the Property Dispute Tribunal and alleged that the clauses constituted fraudulent non-disclosure. The tribunal requested an initial submission from Liang Chao's side within 14 working days. He, Sumin, prepared the submission. It ran to 22 pages and included the following: a copy of the agreement initialed by Fanbo, confirming legal review, a time-stamped record of the consultation session between Liang Qiao and He Sumin regarding the agreement's drafts, a letter from He Sumin confirming that all clauses had been drafted in conformity with standard property transfer law, a certified copy of the transfer agreement showing the date of execution and the date of registration, and a brief section occupying 3 paragraphs noting that the municipal infrastructure order had been a matter of public administrative record at the time of the transfer and that a competent property professional conducting due diligence would have had access to it through standard channels. The submission did not say, "You should have read page 7." It did not say, "You should have checked the infrastructure bureau." It did not need to say these things. The record said them quietly and completely, in the language of documentation. The tribunal, on receipt of the submission, issued a preliminary procedural note indicating that the challenge did not, on its face, disclose sufficient grounds for an expedited hearing. The full challenge could proceed through the standard review timeline, which would take 8 to 12 months. Zhou Heng would spend 8 to 12 months in tribunal proceedings, while the Linhe building accumulated remediation costs. Separately, and through no action of Liang Qiao's, the Dongcheng Commercial Bank Credit Facility Review concluded with a demand notice. The demand was for 420,000 yuan, representing the outstanding balance adjustment required to restore the agreed loan-to-value ratio given the change in the security structure. The demand had a 30-day payment window. She knew about the demand because Zhou Heng sent her a message about it at 11:43 on a Wednesday night. The message was longer than his previous communications and had the quality of a document written in a state of disturbance and then partially revised towards something more controlled, so that the underlying state was still visible in the word choices, even though the sentences had been smoothed out. He wanted her to understand the financial exposure that the property transfer had created. He wanted her to understand that he held her responsible for it. She read it. She set her phone down. She thought for a moment about whether there was anything in the message that required a response, and concluded there was not. She did not respond. 2 days later, Zhou Rong's counsel made contact with He Sumin. He Sumin relayed the substance of the communication. Zhou Rong wished to discuss a private resolution. The language was careful, but the shape of it was clear. A settlement offer was being prepared, and the opening of that conversation was an acknowledgement that the administrative finding was going to stand and that the professional conduct referral was going to proceed, and that the only remaining question was whether any part of the damage could be negotiated into a less absolute configuration. Liang Qiao had told He Sumin that she was not interested in a private settlement. He Sumin relayed this to Zhou Rong's counsel. Zhou Rong's counsel asked whether there was any basis for further discussion. He Sumin said he would ask his client. He Sumin asked his client. His client said no. He Sumin relayed this. There was no further contact from Zhou Rong's counsel for 11 days. Then a second approach, this one with a figure attached, a number that represented what Zhou Rong was willing to pay to close the administrative process without a formal professional conduct proceeding. It was a substantial number. It was, frankly, a serious number. It reflected the degree to which Zhou Rong understood what the conduct proceeding would cost her. Liang Qiao read the figure on a Thursday afternoon, sitting at her desk at Hengyuan during her lunch break, the instant noodles still steaming in the cup beside her laptop. She read it twice. She thought about what the number meant to Zhou Rong, not its nominal value, but what it had cost to offer it, what acknowledgement it contained, what the act of naming that number required a person to know about themselves. Then she called He Sumin. "Tell them the distribution mechanism will run its course," she said. "The conduct referral is not something I initiated and not something I control. I'm not in a position to offer any assurance about its outcome." She paused. "And please note that I did not make a counteroffer." He Sumin made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Noted." She did not make a counteroffer because a counteroffer would imply a negotiating position, and she had no negotiating position. She was not negotiating. The administrative process was proceeding on its own logic, under its own rules, because that was the nature of administrative processes when they had been properly constructed. They did not require the person who had initiated them to continue investing in them. They ran. She ate her lunch. The distribution order came in the 6th week. It was a Thursday, which seemed to her a coincidence with no particular meaning. and she received it via registered mail at her apartment address on a morning when the city was under a light frost, the first of the season. The pavement outside carrying that thin, translucent quality that makes it look like the surface has been very carefully painted. She opened the envelope at the kitchen table, standing still in her coat. The order was 17 pages. Page 4 contained the relevant determination, the beneficial ownership of Qinghe Industrial Assets. Limited, comprising all issued shares and associated assets, was ordered to be transferred to the estate of Liang Jinrong for distribution to the sole surviving direct beneficiary, Liang Chao, within 30 days of the order date. The associated assets were listed in a schedule at the back of the document. They occupied 3 lines. The warehouse building at Lot 7, Dongcheng Industrial Corridor. 1,120 square meters of built structure on a land parcel of approximately 1,800 square meters. The lease agreement with Dongcheng Logistics Limited for a term of 3 years at a monthly rate of 22,500 yuan, currently in its 18th month. The land use rights certificate for the parcel, valid through 2048. She stood at her kitchen table with the distribution order, and she thought about the land use rights certificate. Land use rights in China's industrial corridors were the kind of asset that did not announce themselves. They were quiet things, administrative, documents held in company files, unremarkable in their current state, and quietly extraordinary in what they implied about the land's future. The Dongcheng Industrial Corridor's reclassification for mixed-use development was 18 months away. When it happened, the 1,800 square meters of land beneath the warehouse would change classification. And that change in classification would change the basis on which a prospective buyer or developer valued the parcel. At current industrial land values, the parcel was worth approximately 2.1 million yuan. At mixed-use land values, the values that would apply after the reclassification, it would be worth approximately 5.4 million yuan. Her father had known about the reclassification. She was almost certain of this. He had not built his property work on sentiment or luck. He had built it on the patient attention to the way land changed meaning over time, to the way a city's infrastructure decisions preceded its market decisions, by years, to the way the people who read the Planning Commission minutes in the years before anyone else was reading them were the people who held land that other people would later urgently want. He had been reading the Planning Commission minutes. He had been holding land. Zhou Rong had seen the warehouse and calculated that the right move was to take it. She had been wrong about this the way people are sometimes wrong about assets they have not fully studied. Not in her assessment of its current value, which was modest, but in her assessment of its future, which was not. Liang Chao put the distribution order on the kitchen table beside the photograph. She looked at both of them for a moment. Then she took off her coat, hung it on the hook by the door, and sat down to make the calls. There were 5 calls in the next 2 hours. 1 to Hesumin, confirming receipt and asking him to initiate the 30-day transfer process. 1 to Deng Chao, asking him to prepare a fresh valuation of the warehouse asset under current and projected land classifications, which she would need for a bank meeting she was scheduling for the following week. 1 to the Dongcheng Logistics Limited contact she had identified through the building's existing file, a man named Liu Peng, to introduce herself as the incoming property owner and confirm lease continuity. A courtesy call that was also a documentation step, establishing her ownership relationship with the tenant on the record from day 1. 1 to the leasing agent she had been corresponding with for the apartment across the city, confirming that she would be taking occupancy at the beginning of next month. The 5th call was to the bank, not Dongcheng Commercial Bank, which was Zhou Heng's institution and which she had no intention of ever approaching for anything. A different bank, Zhongshan Savings Bank, which had a commercial property lending division she had researched over the past 2 months with the same methodical attention she applied to every element of this. She asked to schedule a meeting with a commercial lending officer to discuss a property acquisition loan for a mixed-use development project in the Dongcheng corridor. The representative she spoke with was professionally pleasant in the way of bank representatives who are not certain yet what category of client they are dealing with and are maintaining optionality. She explained briefly, and with the specific precision of someone who had spent 9 weeks preparing to explain this, that she was the beneficial owner of an existing industrial property in the Dongcheng corridor currently generating monthly rental income. that the land was scheduled for reclassification in the city's published development plan, and that she was exploring the financing options for a mixed-use conversion project that would significantly increase the asset's developed value. There was a brief pause. "Could I take your name, Ms. Liang Chao? And you're the beneficial owner. You said, the property is currently registered. It will be formally transferred to my name within 30 days, per a distribution order issued by the Haicheng Municipal Administrative Review Office." She had expected this question. "I can provide documentation of the order and the pending transfer at our meeting." Another brief pause. Slightly different texture this time, the recalibration pause. "Of course, we can arrange a preliminary consultation for next week. Thursday would be available." "Thursday is fine." She ended the call. She looked at the photograph one more time. Then she put it in the upper drawer of the kitchen table. Not the back of the drawer where things were stored because they had no place, but the upper drawer where she kept the things she actually used, the pens and the current notebooks and the charging cable that was always getting tangled. She put it there because that was where she wanted it. Not as a reminder of what had been done, not as a symbol, just as a presence. The unremarkable presence of a person who had built something and was owed the account of it. On the 31st day after the distribution order, the warehouse transfer completed and Qinghe Industrial Assets Limited was formally restructured with Liang Chao as sole beneficial owner and director. The share certificate was 3 pieces of paper in a thin corporate registry file. She held them in her hands at the notary's office. Oh, different notary from Weidong, a woman named Pan Yue, whose office was on the eastern side of the city and smelled of fresh paint from a recent renovation, and who had a small frame certificate on the wall behind her desk that Liang Chao read while Pan Yue completed the registration documentation. The certificate was a continuing education credential, notarial practice and professional development. Dated 4 years ago, she thought about credentials, the way some people built them and some people borrowed them and some people used them to do harm, and the credential itself bore none of that. It was just a piece of paper with a date and a seal, indifferent to what the holder had done with what it represented. "All complete?" Pan Yue said, aligning the registered documents in a folder and handing them across the desk. "Congratulations on the acquisition." "Thank you." She walked out of the office into the Dongcheng street, which smelled of the particular industrial corridor combination of diesel and concrete dust, and something metallic from one of the manufacturing units 2 blocks down. The warehouse was a 7-minute walk from here. She had walked to it twice before, on reconnaissance visits in the early weeks of this process, standing outside the roll-up door and looking at the building with the specific, unemotional attention of someone trying to understand what a thing actually is, rather than what it is supposed to be. It was not impressive to look at. It was a building that had been constructed for function, not for any quality that the eye finds interesting. The facade was corrugated metal siding in a faded industrial gray. The windows near the roofline were fixed glass panes, slightly grimy. The parking area in front was cracked asphalt with a painted boundary line that had faded to near invisibility. The roll-up door was a standard commercial installation with a security padlock that the logistics company changed on a monthly rotation per their lease terms. None of that was what she was looking at. She was looking at the 1,800 square meters of land it sat on, which sat at the edge of a development corridor that the city had already decided, in the language of planning documents that most people never read, was going to become something else. She walked to the warehouse. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she took out the key that had been included in the corporate registry transfer, a spare master key for the building's administrative entrance, the small door to the left of the roll-up, and she unlocked it and stepped inside. The interior was exactly what a logistics warehouse interior is. A large, cool, slightly dim space, occupied by shelving systems and stacked inventory in various stages of organization, the smell of cardboard and stretch wrap, and the faint trace of diesel from the forklifts parked at the rear. The ceiling was high. The floor was sealed concrete. The overhead lighting was a grid of fluorescent tubes, half of which were on, giving the space that half-illuminated quality that warehouse interiors always have, pockets of brightness and large passages of shadow. Liu Peng was in his site office at the back, a glass-walled room stacked with clipboards and a whiteboard covered in numbers she recognized as stock counts. He looked up when she entered and then stood when he registered who she was. She had sent him a photograph in the confirmatory message after her call. Ms. Liang? He was a compact, pragmatic man of 50 or so, with the slightly weathered look of someone who spent most of their working hours in physical spaces rather than offices. He extended his hand. Good to meet you in person? Mr. Liu. She shook it. I wanted to come in before the formal transfer paperwork circulates. I know tenancy changes can create uncertainty, and I wanted to assure you directly that I intend to honor the lease terms completely. He relaxed slightly, the way people relax when a concern they have been managing internally is directly addressed. We've been happy here, he said. The location works well for our distribution routes. Good. She looked through the glass wall at the warehouse floor. The lease runs through June of next year, year 3? I'll be in touch before then about renewal. The terms will be fair. She meant this. Not from sentiment. She was not running a charity, but from the practical understanding that a reliable tenant, paying a going market rate in a building that was about to become significantly more valuable, as land was exactly the kind of arrangement worth maintaining. Appreciate that, Liu Peng said. She stayed for another 10 minutes. She asked about the roof maintenance schedule, about the utilities setup, about the access code system the logistics company used for their 24-hour delivery shifts. She listened to his answers with the same attention she gave to everything. Not performing interest, but genuinely assembling information, building the picture of what she now owned in its actual operating reality. Then she thanked him and left. Outside, the Dongcheng Street was carrying the late afternoon activity of an industrial corridor. A delivery truck pulling out from a loading bay down the street, a group of warehouse workers in high-visibility vests gathered at a corner convenience store. A stray dog examining the contents of a tipped-over bin with methodical patience. She stood on the cracked asphalt in front of the building and looked at it one more time. There was a specific, quiet quality to the feeling she had standing here. Not triumph, not resolution. Those words had emotional shapes that did not quite match the thing she was feeling, which was more structural than emotional. The feeling of standing in a place that your father had stood in, that he had looked at with the same forward-facing patience with which he looked at everything, and understanding that you had found it, that the thing he built had not been lost after all, that it had only been temporarily in the wrong place. She would not keep the warehouse forever. The development reclassification was 18 months away, and the bank meeting on Thursday was going to establish what her options were. Whether she converted the asset herself, whether she sold the land rights at the post-reclassification value, whether she partnered with a development company on terms she controlled, she did not know yet. She was not certain yet, and she had learned the difference between not knowing and being unprepared. She had the time and the liquidity to let the best answer become clear. She had the time. She walked back toward the bus stop, her footsteps on the cracked asphalt carrying that particular sound, not quite hollow, not quite solid, of concrete that has been there long enough to have its own acoustic character. On a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the warehouse transfer completed, she received a notification from He Sumin that the Property Dispute Tribunal had dismissed Zhou Heng's challenge to the Linhei transfer liability clauses. The dismissal was on procedural grounds. The challenge had been filed past the relevant limitation window, a detail Fanbo had apparently miscalculated in his initial timeline assessment. A substantive refiling was possible, but would require leave from the tribunal and a demonstration of exceptional grounds. Fanbo had filed for leave. The tribunal had not yet responded. She did not check for tribunal updates again that day. She filed the notification in the folder where she kept He Sumin's correspondence and made a note in the first notebook and went to work. At lunch, she bought a different kind of instant noodle than usual, one with a slightly richer broth that cost 40 cents more, and ate it at her desk and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of luxury, the luxury of having a mind that was not currently required for emergency navigation. She thought about what she wanted to do with the investment account. The 218,000 yuan was currently in a standard savings product. She had left it there deliberately, not wanting to make investment decisions while she was still in the active phase of the property resolution. Now the active phase was largely complete. The ongoing elements, the tribunal, the conduct referral, the bank negotiations, were running on their own momentum. She did not need to attend to them continuously. The money needed a purpose. She was not going to buy something visible with it. Not a car, not a wardrobe, not anything that announced itself. That was not the phase she was in. The phase she was in was accumulation. Quiet, precise, patient accumulation of the kind her father had practiced, and which she had finally, after a life and a half, fully understood. She had a property generating monthly rental income. She had a bank meeting on Thursday. She had a development corridor that would, in 18 months, change the landscape of what she owned. She thought about property management. She thought about whether there was a residential or light commercial property in the Haecheng district, not the Linhai area, which was already complicated, but further east, in the developing residential belt, that the same planning documents she had been reading had marked as a growth zone. That was currently undervalued because the buyers who would eventually want it did not yet know they would want it. She thought about what it would mean to buy that kind of property now, at now's prices, with the knowledge of what would be available in 18 months. She finished her noodles. She opened the planning document folder she kept on her work laptop, archived, unrelated to Hung Yuan's business, personal research, and spent the last 10 minutes of her lunch break reading the density tables for the Eastern Residential Development Zone. She did not think about Zhou Heng while doing this, or Zhou Rong, or the Linhe building with its buzzing infrastructure order and its 3 tenants paying 300 yuan a month, and its 1.4 million yuan bank demand, and Fanbo's miscalculation and the tribunal's pending response to the leave application. She did not need to think about any of it. It was running. This was the part that she had not understood in her first life, the part that she had understood only in the litigation years, when it was already too late, and she had already spent the best of herself on the wrong currency. The people who had taken from her had not done so through strength. They had done so through asymmetry of information and through the particular advantage that accrues to people who understand systems that their targets do not. She understood systems now. Not perfectly. There was always more to know, always a document she had not yet read, always a timeline she had miscalculated slightly. But she understood the grammar of them. She understood how they moved and what they rewarded and what they required. And the thing they required, the foundational thing, the thing that every other capacity depended on, was patience that was not passive. Active patience, the kind that builds while it waits. Her father had had it. She had it now. She had bought it at the highest price. She closed the planning document folder and opened the current audit file she was working through and spent the remainder of the afternoon checking receivables for a textile company that had a recurring error pattern in its quarterly reconciliation, a pattern that was entirely innocent, a data entry habit by a specific accounts payable staff member who transposed 2 digits consistently, but which required documentation nonetheless. The error was small. The documentation mattered. She noted it in her report with the same careful, even hand she gave to everything. The following Thursday, she had breakfast at a stall near her apartment building. Fried dough and warm soy milk, 2 yuan total, eaten standing at the counter while the morning assembled itself around her. The stall was owned by an older man who ran it with his daughter, dividing the labor with the unconscious precision of a long practice, him at the fryer and her at the register, and the two of them passing equipment and change and comments back and forth in the half-verbal, half-gestural shorthand of people who have worked together in a small space for a long time. She watched them for a moment while she ate, not sentimentally, just with the attentive, interested stillness that had become her default posture in the world, the posture of someone who is always slightly more interested in what is actually happening than in what they had been expecting to happen. The fried dough was hot and slightly uneven, the way things made by hand always are, with a crisp exterior that gave way to something soft and yielding and much hotter than you expected. She ate it carefully, not burning herself, and drank the soy milk in the plain way of a person who is fueling a body for a day, not performing a meal. Then she walked to the bus stop, carrying her plain canvas bag, wearing her plain work coat, unremarkable in every visible way. The bank meeting was at 10. She would be early. She walked to the bus stop through the frost-sharp air, her breath making brief white clouds that dissolved immediately, the city around. Her carrying the particular morning energy of a place that has been sleeping and is now, all at once, returning to itself. The buses beginning their runs, the street vendors assembling their setups, the delivery vehicles accelerating into the day's first circuit. Ordinary, operational, fully underway. She got on the bus. The Zhongshan Savings Bank's commercial lending office was on the 14th floor of a building in the city's central district, with windows that looked out over the commercial corridor and, on clear days, toward the developing Eastern Belt whose planning documents she had been reading with such attention. She arrived at 9:45 and checked in with the reception and sat in the waiting area with a glass of water she did not drink. At 10 past 10, she was escorted to a meeting room by a junior officer whose name she immediately noted. Wang Fei, first-year commercial lending, slightly nervous in the specific way of someone who has been assigned to escort in. Important meeting, and has been told to be professional, but has not yet fully metabolized what professional means in the context of someone whose file they have reviewed. He had reviewed her file. She could tell from the way he walked beside her, not leading her with the confident ownership of someone conducting a routine appointment, but alongside her with the slightly adjusted pace of someone calibrating. Good. The commercial lending officer was a woman named Song Jian, mid-40s, with the specific contained energy of someone who assessed risk for a living and had developed, over many years, a high sensitivity to the gap between what people said about their financial position and what their documentation actually showed. She stood when Liang Chao entered and extended her hand, and they shook and sat down across from each other. "Thank you for making time," Liang Chao said. "Of course." Song Jian looked at her with that assessing quality, not unfriendly, but precise. "You mentioned the Dongcheng corridor. Walk me through what you're looking at." Liang Chao set her folder on the table and opened it to the first page. "I hold full beneficial ownership of a light industrial property in the Dongcheng corridor," she said, and her voice was steady and clear and carried no performance of anything, no eagerness, no anxiety, no performed confidence. Just the even, direct quality of someone explaining a factual situation to a person who is equipped to understand it. The property generates current monthly income of 22,500 yuan from a logistics tenant with 17 months remaining on a 3-year lease. The land parcel is rated for mixed-use development reclassification in the city's 18-month planning cycle. She placed the distribution order and the share certificate and Deng Chao's valuation in front of Song Jian. Song Jian looked at them, she picked up the valuation, she read it with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who has learned that speed. In document review is a form of professional negligence. "The projected post-reclassification value," she said, without looking up, "assumes the development parameters in the current planning draft remain unchanged through final approval." "Correct. That's a reasonable assumption for an 18-month horizon, but it's not certain." "Nothing is certain in an 18-month horizon," Liang Chao said. "The current income yield is sufficient to service a moderate acquisition loan, without reference to any future revaluation. The development trajectory is upside, not basis." Song Jian looked up from the valuation. She studied Liang Chao for a moment with that precise risk assessment attention. Then something in her expression settled. Not warmth exactly, but the equivalent of a calculation arriving at a satisfying figure. "What acquisition are you considering?" "There's a residential commercial parcel in the Eastern Development Belt." She turned to the next page in the folder. "Currently listed at 1.7 million yuan, on the market for 4 months without a buyer. The listing price reflects the current zoning, which doesn't account for the development plan's density projections for that belt." She placed a second document, the planning extract, the density tables, the projected infrastructure investment schedule for the Eastern Belt. "My assessment is that it's undervalued by approximately 30% against its 18-month forward value." Song Jian looked at the planning extract. The meeting went on for 53 minutes. At the end of it, Song Jian said that a preliminary lending assessment could be completed within 5 working days, and that subject to the formal valuation of the Dongcheng property, which she recommended using Zhongshan's authorized appraiser for, which was standard for properties offered as collateral, she saw no barrier in principle to a facility in the range Liang Chao had indicated. Liang Chao thanked her. She stood and collected her documents and shook Song Jian's hand again. On the way out, passing through the waiting area, she picked up the untouched glass of water from the small table where she had left it and carried it back to the reception desk. "Thank you," she said to the receptionist, who looked slightly surprised by this. It was not the usual behavior of people who had just come from a bank meeting, and took the glass. Outside, the city was in full morning operation. The commercial corridor carried the density of late-morning foot traffic, the lunch hour approach beginning to build, the street below the building visible from the steps as a moving band of purposeful transit. She stood on the steps for a moment and adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. Then she walked to the bus stop. Her phone buzzed as she reached the corner. It was Hey Suman. She read the message without stopping walking. The tribunal had denied leave for Joe Heng's refiled challenge. The denial was final. The liability transfer stood. She put her phone in her bag. At the bus stop, she waited for 3 minutes. The bus arrived with the slightly aggressive approach of a driver who has a schedule and does not apologize for it. She got on, paid, and found a seat near the window. The city moved past the glass. Somewhere on the other side of it, in the part of the city where the Linhay building stood, with its buzzing overhead lights and its dead succulent on the windowsill, she was thinking of Wei Dong's office, not Joe Heng's building, but the association was close enough. A man was opening mail, or fielding calls, or sitting in a meeting with Fan Bo, working through the architecture of a position that had been designed to look like a trap closing on someone else, but was in fact his own. She did not think about him with satisfaction. She thought about him the way she thought about the incorrect entry pattern in the textile company's receivables, as a problem that had been documented, identified, and resolved, as something that required careful attention for a period of time and now required less. The bus moved through the city with the steady, indifferent progress of public transit everywhere, carrying its quota of bodies in various states of attention and inattention toward the various destinations they had each arranged for themselves. She looked out the window and thought about the Eastern Development Belt. She thought about what a residential commercial parcel looked like when the street it was on changed what it meant, when the foot traffic built and the density increased, and the city's long, patient planning logic finally surfaced into the visible world and turned what had been a quiet street into one that people wanted to be on. She thought about sitting in a property, not just holding it on paper, but actually present in it in the physical way that made ownership real in the body rather than just in the mind. She was 31 years old. She had a warehouse in a development corridor and a bank meeting that had gone well, and an estate distribution order in Hasuman's files, and a folder of planning documents she had been reading for 6 months. She had 218,000 yuan in an account that was about to become collateral. She had time. The bus stopped at her transfer point. She got off. Standing on the pavement in the late morning air, she took out her phone and opened the real estate listing she had saved in March, 4 months ago, before any of this had resolved, when she had been working on what was still theoretical, when the certainty she needed had been a thing she was building toward rather than one she had arrived at. The listing for the Eastern Belt property, listed at 1.7 million yuan. 4 months on the market. She called the listing agent. "Yes," she said when the agent answered. "I'm interested in a viewing. This week, if possible." She listened. "Tomorrow morning is fine." She hung up. The light at the crosswalk changed to green. She crossed.